Hello and welcome to Inside Music, episode number 91. I'm your host, James Shotwell, and we have a great conversation for you this week. I told you it would be longer, and I have delivered. My guest, Deanna Chapman, is an aspiring music industry professional who might as well already have a career in this business. Deanna does not currently get paid to write about music or to promote music or to work with artists, but it's what she longs to do, and she's spent every minute of her life for the past several years working towards that goal. I respect Deanna Chapman immensely. I don't even remember how we both met, probably through Twitter, but as I started to see the things she wrote and started to see the way she cared for bands and people on the come up, I really started to enjoy her work. And then she has her podcast, Misaligned, which she has with a few co-hosts, and that's great. And then she invited me to be on her show, and she turned out to be a great interviewer as well. And at the end of it all, the only question I have is, how does Deanna Chapman not already have a career in the music industry? And that's a question that I actually have about a lot of people. Some of them have been on the show in the past. I meet a lot of really talented, incredibly driven, clearly passionate people who are thinking about the future of the music business in ways people who are currently getting paid to keep the music business alive have not yet considered. And I believe that that needs to change. And I think it will change in the years ahead. And that's kind of what I talk about with Deanna in this conversation. We get into a lot of things here. We start off by talking a little bit about Deanna's history, and then we segue into the changing of journalism and how it has impacted some of the big hot button topics this year. And things like allegations against musicians and the parallels we can draw between that and the way mainstream media is covering police shootings. There's a lot of heavy stuff here. And then after that, we transition just a bit into what the music industry is going to look like moving forward, and where, if anywhere, there's a place for people like Deanna and myself. And I know that that's going to sound a little bit like a negative, and there are negative moments in the show, but overall, we are both one and the same, and by that I mean we are both supporters of the future of the music business. We both believe in the music industry as much as we believe in our favorite artists, and we are working together in our own way to try to make it a better place. And we're hoping that through this conversation we'll connect with a few more of you out there who are hoping to maybe enter the industry or are already in the industry and know the things that need to change, and maybe we can come together and find a way to make this all a little bit better for everyone involved. It's a pretty big setup to a conversation that runs about an hour and 15 minutes long, but I think it's going to be totally worth your time. Before I get there, I do want to tell you a few quick things, the biggest of them being that this episode of Inside Music and every episode of this show is only made possible by Holix, the music industry's leading digital promotional distribution company. What that means is that Holix helps the music industry share new and unreleased albums without fear of piracy. How they do that is something that you can find out on their website, Holix.com. That's HAULIX.com. If you visit Holix.com, you can also sign up for a free, no-risk trial of their platform, and I tell you, it's pretty great. And yes, I work for Holix, but I've seen the competition, and Holix is best. Second, I need you to be following this show on Twitter. We talk about this every single week, but there's a community there, and it's growing, and the people that are coming out of the woodwork to talk about the show and talk about the conversations we have on the show, there's some of my favorite people on earth. They might be my favorite people after my parents, my wife, my cats, and my dog, and that's like 6 people down, but it's still pretty good. At Inside Music Pod. That's at Inside Music POD. Third, since Deanna doesn't have an album or anything like that to promote, I'm going to tell you to check out her podcast. Misaligned is a fantastic show that explores a lot of little nooks and crannies of the industry and also does a whole bunch of other things. It's a little bit of a variety show, as you'll hear her describe here in a minute. And I think it's really great. I was actually just on it, so if you need a place to start, Misaligned, the most recent episode of Misaligned, or 2 episodes back whenever you're hearing this, James Shotwell is the guest. That's me. I host this show, and I hope you check it out. And one more. So 4 points this week. The fourth one, the song you're about to hear is chosen by Deanna. We talk about it in the episode, but it's by the band Fossil Youth, who I hope to have on the show very soon. They're a fantastic up-and-coming rock band, and I urge you to seek out their upcoming album. Pre-order it, stream it, whatever you have to do, just make sure you experience Fossil Youth in full. Okay? Let's get to the show.
Grows impatient all of the time, and every once in a while it's followed by a brash goodbye. I know I hurt you even though I never really wanted to. You said you
Well, I try to keep it easy for guests.
Yeah.
You want to be consistent, so I think so. This is going to be episode number 91 or 92. I forget at this point.
Okay.
But as we're getting close, I think at 100, I'm gonna kind of do like an overhaul of the quality of the show and maybe kind of the formatting a little bit. Kind of have
Right.
because I have like a like a milestone of some kind. But in the weeks before that, I'm like, let's just keep doing it the way we always have, and when we hit 100, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we're going to hit 50 next week. So, although like I'm the only one who's been on 50 episodes, so it's just kind of like, all right.
Yeah, I'm still kind of in disbelief that I'm so close to 100. It's like, where did the time go, and what have I been doing with my life?
Yeah.
I
And
don't,
I mean, for Misaligned, we would have hit 50 had I originally started doing the guest episodes on the
mhm.
off weeks, because for a while when it first started, we were just doing the every other week, and I didn't have the idea to do the guest episodes until we were at least, I want to say, 10 episodes in, maybe.
Mm.
And then I was like, oh, maybe I should do this. So, yeah, we would have hit 50 like 10 episodes ago or something had I started that from the beginning.
Yeah, it's kind of strange, right? Like this is kind of a fun thing for us to start talking about off the top, but like starting a podcast is kind of hard because you're like, well, I don't, you don't really know what the show is going to be until you start doing it. Like then you're like, oh,
Right.
this is what it is. Because at first you're like, this is what I want to do, and I feel like once you start recording, maybe even like it takes like 2 or 3 episodes before you're like, okay, now I kind of, this is what this is.
Yeah, and with you at least, it's always been you and a guest. For Misaligned, it's changed like I want to say 3 times now. When we started, it was myself, Ashley, Aaron, and Caitlin from Absolute Punk. So I'm sure people who listen to your podcast probably know who she is. And then it was myself, Caitlin, and Megan Moore, who's also a writer at Modern Vinyl. And then now it's just myself and Megan, and we haven't bothered getting a third co-host really. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, if we keep it that way. And then basically, I guess you could say we even have a fourth iteration of the podcast, because then the guest episodes, it's just myself and the guest. So there's kind of a lot going on already within the first 50 episodes of this podcast. And we've added the Misaligned Book Club, and we're kind of still trying new things. And to say that 50 episodes in, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's like, is it good that we keep trying to change things and make them better? Or do people just kind of want to listen to the same podcast they're used to listening to?
I think you can be both. That's kind of the cool thing about podcasts and kind of become whatever. Like I kind of think of Misaligned, it's almost like a variety show. You never know what's going to happen week to week. Like you always know I'm going to be talking about something probably not that related to music with somebody that works in music like every week. Like that's pretty much all my
Right.
show is. But with yours, you can tune in every week and be like, what's going to happen this week? What are we doing this week?
Okay, good to know that's working for
At
us.
least that's how I see it. But for people listening now who maybe haven't heard Misaligned yet, even though they should have listened to last week's episode because I was on it. But if they haven't
Yes.
yet, what is Misaligned, or what is it? What did it start out to be? As we just discussed, it's not really anything. But what is it? What is the initial goal that you started out with, and then what are you still doing that, or you feel like you're still working towards that, etc.
Right. Well, Chris from Modern Vinyl had approached me about starting a podcast that would be hosted through Modern Vinyl and everything. And his main goal was to get a podcast with women talking about music, because this isn't an exact quote from him, but he was like, there's a lot of white guys doing this, basically, or a lot of guys in general. But for the most part, it is a lot of white guys who are also doing all of, the music based podcasts. And while I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, I just think that means there's more room for women to have a podcast of their own and that sort of thing. And as far as I know, Misaligned is, at least within our little group of music podcasts that we listen to, the first one to really do that. I know you and Ray Harkins have had women guests on, but it's never been a thing where women have just come on and hosted a podcast to talk about music. And Chris really wanted to bring that voice into the scene because of all of the things that have been happening as of late, all of the sexual assault allegations, concerts being safe spaces, and that sort of thing. So he just wanted a different perspective because, for those of you who don't know, the Modern Vinyl podcast is three guys most of the time. I know sometimes not all three hosts can make it on the show. And then Chris will do guest episodes. So Misaligned is, I don't want to say it's just the women's version of that, but it's similar in style to what the Modern Vinyl podcast initially started doing.
And then how did Chris and you first get to know each other?
Well, he asked me to be on the Modern Vinyl podcast, and then I guess he thought it went so well that he wanted me to find other women to host a podcast with. And I think I more so knew about the podcast through James Cassar. And I just knew him because he kind of knew a lot of my friends in Philly. Like, he was familiar with Eric and Emily at Lamo, who I went to school with, Zach Zarillo, and a few other of the music industry kids at Drexel. So I've never met any of them. I've never met James, Michael, or Chris, but it's like we've brought about this kind of internet connection and internet friendship. And that's kind of how this whole thing started. And I mean, I feel like it's that way with a lot of our people we call friends and whatnot. Like I would consider like you, Jacob Tender, James Cassar friends, even though, we've never met because we all live in different states.
And for people that we're just slowly rolling it back to the beginning, and then I guess we'll move forward. But prior to me and Chris, so for everyone, where do you kind of come from in the world of music, discussion? Like, what was your starting point? And like, if people maybe haven't heard Misaligned, maybe they saw your work somewhere else. Like, can you kind of give us the short history?
Yeah. So, long story short, in between eighth and ninth grade, when you have to take health class in high school or whatever, one of the teachers had us kind of write a page or a paragraph about what we wanted to do with our lives. And I put that I wanted to be like a music producer like Randy Jackson or something, which, I wish I made that much money. But obviously it kind of turned into something else over the years because in high school I did intern at a recording studio, but I realized, maybe the tech side of the music industry was not for me. So then I went to Drexel in Philadelphia for music industry. And that's kind of where things really started to get going for me. And I ended up living with Zach Zarillo our sophomore year until I finished. And I happened to finish early and kind of just left him there to fend for himself, And there I started writing for like Drexel's own music website that was student run. It was called The Correspondence. And that's really where I started getting into doing reviews and whatnot. And I was helping Zach out with, news posts on Property of Zach. I was creating the Spotify playlist for all of those band playlists that he would do. And then from there, I sort of started contributing here and there to, like the decade pieces for albums that turned 10. So I would have little spots on Property of Zach, and it kind of just built from there. And my senior year at Drexel is when I started Wreck-It Records, and I worked with, I want to say, 3 bands during that time. And while some went better than others, it was definitely a learning experience. And I realized that despite bands being difficult to work with at times, doing the label thing, even if I don't necessarily have a budget for bands to go record, $3,000 albums or whatever, I still wanted to help them in any way I could. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I was at a job at a company called Music Reports, and that was essentially just data entry. So it wasn't really too music based. Like it wasn't music based enough for me to be satisfied with that. Sure, it paid well, and I still kind of had time to do the other things, but I also started Hi-Fi Noise my senior year at Drexel, and that's really where I got my own writing habits going. And that site has since evolved from just a music blog to covering comic books, sports once in a while. And then from there, I started writing for, a dedicated Packers website, a dedicated Lakers website, and a comic book website. And while none of these things pay, it's still something I want to do. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with this. And obviously, Misaligned happened in between there. That actually started last year.
So you're like a classic hardworking unpaid music professional.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a thing that kind of stands on its own in the digital age because of, I guess, the ease of access to different fields. Like you can have a label and stuff, but they've always existed. The unpaid music professional, I mean.
Right.
So at this point in your life, what would you like to be, I guess? What is the career goal? Or is there more, is it just like if any one of these kind of pays off, that would be good? Or is there like one that you're kind of banking on more than the others?
Yeah, I think I really would be okay with either, whether it's writing, publicity, or the label. I would be perfectly happy with any of those working out. And that's why I'm still putting effort into all three of those, because I know some people think it's easier to just stick with one thing and focus on that. But I've never really found myself able to do that. I feel like I like way too many things to just spend all of my energy on one of them. And especially someone who's into, music, sports, comic books, TV shows, and a whole range of things that I almost feel like it would be unfair to myself to just say, okay, I'm just going to focus on this one thing and ignore everything else so I can make this one thing work for me.
I totally get that. I mean, that was kind of always my approach, and I guess in a lot of ways it still is. I might have a job working at Holics, but I write for Substream and I do a bunch of other things that are like, well, they don't pay necessarily, but I would like to, maybe one day, maybe it'll lead somewhere. You always got to keep that door open,
Right.
where you're like, maybe this will pay off. I like that. No, I think your backstory is good, and I think you made a good point there earlier where you said, well, I guess Chris made it initially about there not being a lot of women or being a lot of white dudes, and I had the same thought not just about podcasts in general, but about my podcast where I'm like, okay, we're nearing 100 episodes, and I think I've had like 4 women on in 90 episodes.
Right.
And that's not like an intentional thing. Like I'm not like, oh, I don't want to have more women on. But sometimes I feel like, I guess what you're offered more often than not is dudes. Like it's rare that someone's like, do you want to have, getting asked to interview female artists, as you know, is something that happens regularly. But being offered an in-depth conversation with female artists is not something that happens as often, in my experience anyways.
Yeah. And, your episode with Baby Metal, you said, on Misaligned that is one of your most popular episodes. And I just think, even though that was a much shorter episode than usual, that kind of goes to show how popular women can be in the music industry, especially when they're not necessarily your typical, pop star and that sort of thing. And I do think it is harder to get women artists on podcasts because personally, when I've been doing these guest episodes, it's pretty much been all guys. It actually might literally be all guys. And at least, that kind of balances out with our regular episodes. But I don't think I've had a single request from anyone's PR or anything to have a woman come on the podcast. And I think with the scene that we kind of focus in, it's just a reality that there's not all that many women in the scene in general in bands.
I think that is a reality. And the other thing that I've encountered is like I had Anna Acosta on once and we had a really great conversation, but like she came on specifically so that we could talk about women's issues in the world of music, or how a mistreatment of women in music, and journalism standards and covering abuse of women and things like that. But it was almost like we had a very technical conversation about all of the problems that make it so that we don't have more women podcasters and women on podcasts. But but again, it was almost like a cheat episode, because it was like, well, I had a female guest, but we didn't really get into what makes her tick. We just kind of got into what ticks her off. And I feel like in this scene, when there are opportunities to interview a lot of female professionals or musicians, especially right now, like that's what the conversation is. Like when I talk to someone like a Chris Farron, we kind of get lost in something stupid, or like on the recent time he was on, we talked about like death a lot, which isn't necessarily stupid, but it's kind of like a tangent about something unreal. That was like a very personal thing where you kind of get the sense that you're having a moment with that individual. But I feel like there's a lot of pressure on women who do get the opportunity to do press to kind of be a voice for all of the other women, that it's sometimes they don't get to tell their own story as a result.
Yeah, and you mentioned that episode with Anna, which I listened to, and I thought it was great. I just don't want Misaligned to be that every episode, you know. Yes, it was started with the intentions of getting women's voices and opinions on the scene. And at the beginning, it did have a lot of that sort of conversation. Like, we pretty extensively covered the Kesha case. And I feel like after a while, it's just sort of draining to keep talking about these same problems over and over again. And I don't want the podcast to become known just for that. Like, I don't want it to be, oh, Misaligned, that's the podcast where they just talk about the issues with women in the scene. Yes, they're important things to talk about, but that's not the only thing women have to talk about.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think sometimes I feel like part of the problem with getting that message out or getting it to the people who need to hear it is that you can't just have that message. You have to kind of envelope it in something else. You know what I mean? It has to be a
Right.
sandwich. It's like the idea of how people say that the best way to insult somebody is to give them two compliments. To be like, oh, I really like your hair. You could work on your writing. And I really like your personality. You know, just kind of
Yeah.
you sandwich something kind of negative in between two compliments. And I feel like that's almost the same approach that works best when it's trying to tackle those big topics. Is like the people who have like on Twitter, their Twitter handles is like, punk feminist, and every single tweet is about, right now it's the guy in, I think it's Turnover. There's a guy in Turnover that's being accused of some wrongdoing with women, and like that's a story that needs to get out. But if every single tweet is about throwing shade at that dude, the people that you're trying to reach just kind of tune it out. Whereas if Absolute Punk, or sorry, Chorus, runs a story on it, it's kind of nestled between like Yellow Card released new video, dude in band accused of doing something shitty, and then someone announces tour dates, and I think it sometimes it gets more traction that way because it's treated like like it's not the only story, but it's maybe an important story.
Right. And like I mentioned with the Kesha case, we covered that extensively. And at some point, it's like, I feel like we don't have to cover every single instance of this because, again, if we did, that's all the podcast would end up being about. And that's not really the direction I want the podcast to go in. And yes, these things are very important to talk about, but I feel like I don't want to spend every podcast talking about that. Like, that'll kind of get to you eventually. And when you have the same people talking about the same thing every week or every other week, what have you, it's kind of like you can't really bring up any new points at some point.
No, I totally agree. It's like what else can be said? Like we all know that it's a terrible thing. It's like the it's like the principle of diminishing returns. You know what I mean? If you just keep
Right.
doing the same thing over and over, it's not gonna get anywhere. Which is kind of reason why I was excited to get you on the show, even though you were like, "What are we going to talk about?" And in my mind, I was like, "We're just going to talk about you. Like we're gonna talk about whatever comes to mind," because I felt like one of the problems that I've encountered when I've had female guests in the past is that we kind of get this idea where we're like, let's talk about the problems, whatever, and then we just spend an hour doing that, and I end up and I'm like, well, I don't know anything more about this person, and I don't know that the listeners do, and I don't want to just preach at them. You know what I mean?
Right.
I want them to walk away and be like, I want to follow Deanna Chapman, and if it's part of your prerogative to bring to light shitty dudes in music or whatever, then hopefully they pick up on that. But there's a lot more to you than that.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like I'm not even the right person to talk about these things because personally, I haven't had any experiences like that. And I know when we did the assault and allegations episode, I believe it was like episode 21 and a half or something. I know Anna was a little upset with the position I took on it because in her view, I was playing devil's advocate and I didn't realize I was doing this. I was just, trying to ask questions because I'm not familiar with these things happening. And just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I've had these things happen to me at shows and whatnot, because I've gone to plenty of shows by myself and, for the most part, people just leave me alone and I, go enjoy the show. And I think so maybe then I came across the wrong way in that conversation. And while it was a shorter episode, there were still things I need to learn myself from that. And it's kind of always a process, no matter who is talking about these things, because we're all coming at it from different perspectives. And I just thought, we should do this episode because this is happening and someone needs to talk about it. So, I mean, Anna is the only one, as far as I know, who actually made any comment about it. I know some people said the episode was fine and whatnot, but she gave, helpful criticism, basically. So, it's still a learning process, even for myself. And I feel like that's also another reason to not necessarily cover it every single episode, because, like I said earlier, you'll kind of end up bringing up the same points over and over and over again. And you can only bring them up so many times before it kind of gets mind numbing. And it's like, okay, we're talking about the same thing over and over and over again, and nothing's changing.
And not only is nothing changing, but these things happen. The people that are doing these things are clearly not persuaded by the current efforts to educate people or shade them or whatever you want to say. So at some point you have to kind of be like, okay, let's take a step back and try to figure out a better way to do this, because clearly just like raising our pitchforks and torches through Twitter is not doing anything other than complaining after the fact, which is fine. But if you want to if you want to incite real change, you have to kind of precipitate it a little bit.
Right.
And and to go along with this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, is do you think, and this turnover thing has been going on for like 3 or 4 days now, and I haven't seen any of the major sites pick it up yet, and I'm wondering if maybe, like you said, there's a little bit of burnout happening, because for websites even, it's like, how many times can we write the same story? And I mean, they're always good for clicks. If we're gonna get like into the dirty truth of journalism, like if it bleeds, it leads. If it allegedly assaults somebody, it leads. But sites aren't picking this one up so fast, and I'm wondering if we're going to start seeing a trend where, like, 2015 was the year of allegation stories. Like, there were a bunch of big stories, and every single one of them, even alternative press, eventually came around to like talking about some of these things. In 2016, right, there's been a few, almost all notably smaller artists. Like, I think this turnover one's probably the biggest one so far, and they're getting less and less coverage as time goes on, and less follow through, because it's not just the mentions on the blogs, it's the due diligence of like, okay, what actually happened, the whole journalistic process. And I feel like it's getting diminished with each new accusation. Do you think that that's also part of the problem, is that we've hit a wall in terms of how much you can be like, this terrible thing happened and it shouldn't happen and we should whatever, chase these people out of town? Like, do you think that's kind of been taken as far as it can go, and now we've got to figure out a new way to make it something that people actually care about, or that hits them and isn't just like another news story?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I didn't even know about this turnover one until you just mentioned it here. And I feel like, in a similar way to outside of the music scene, it's sort of like, every time we hear a cop shot an unarmed man again, and more often than not, these people tend to be African American, and these are things that shouldn't be happening no matter what. But no matter how many big sites cover it, and especially with the police shootings, you have much bigger sites covering these events. You have Washington Post and all of those sites, and still nothing is really happening to stop it. So it's kind of like, a vicious cycle of these things happening over and over and over again. And no matter what the press does, that doesn't really stop it from happening again. So I feel like, yes, it should be posted about, but at the same time, you kind of have to step back and think, okay, if I post about this, what effect is it really having? And like I said, obviously these are things that need to be talked about, but just talking about them isn't what's going to fix them necessarily.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, it's something that's almost like we need like reform for covering allegations and stuff. It's a thing that's kind of getting out of hand, and I'm always curious to talk to another journalist about it, because it's like you mentioned, you did a great kind of parallel there, the idea of police shooting people. So there have been two of those this week. The one
Right.
in Charlotte being like the headline as we're talking right now with the riots
Yeah.
and stuff. But I had the same thought this week, where the first one happened at like 3 in the afternoon, and by like that night, the guy shot when his car stalled on the road. That guy was a headline, was a trending topic by the time I woke up the next morning. And then this one in Charlotte happened so fast that the guy who got shot next to his stalled car, like he was immediately out of the news. Like the Charlotte thing has already overshadowed that other case. And
Yeah. And
that's fine, but it's, again, it's not being covered the same way that we even covered these stories 2 months ago. Like they're so quickly becoming just a part of the daily news cycle that it's like who's impacted outside of the, the immediate community. The communities are still getting upset, and I guess there's a parallel to draw to that, to the niche of the alternative community, who is still really carrying the torch for change here. But that, I feel like the size of the audience that is moved or feels the urgency to fight for change in these situations is diminishing across the board.
yeah, and as you know, I was in jury duty yesterday and I did end up getting dismissed, but one of the other jurors that was in the jury selection with me, once he found out that the only witnesses who would possibly be testifying were, I believe, two cops and a crime lab guy, he was an African American man, and he was like, honestly, with the way things are going right now, I don't think I could sit in on this jury and be unbiased. And obviously the judge and the lawyers want you to be honest, and it was like a possession case for whatever. And obviously with jury duty, you're not really supposed to talk about what cases are about, but ultimately him and I were dismissed, and one other guy was dismissed because he didn't want to reschedule his business trip or couldn't reschedule his business trip or what have you. But I was sitting there and it was kind of infuriating to me how slow our system is in general. And when the man made that comment, I was just like, yeah, I really agree with him, because none of these cops are being prosecuted. I feel like not a single one has been prosecuted, and most of them don't even lose their jobs either. And it's kind of like, the judge had made a comment that basically to the jury, we need to do better. And I was sitting there thinking, I was like, the jury's not the ones who need to do better. It's the prosecution and these cops, and the system in general just feels so broken right now. And we see this a lot with, sexual assault cases where most of the time people aren't even charged. And it's sort of like, why are you bothering to tell the jury that we're the ones who need to do better when there's so many other things wrong with the system? And personally, after being there all day and, they didn't even finish picking the jury, it's like, okay, so you have us come in for jury duty and you can't even select a jury within one day. And we had an hour and 45-minute lunch. Like, that's a ridiculous amount of time for a lunch break. So to me, it's just kind of like there are so many things that need to be fixed before we can even start fixing other things.
No, you're absolutely right. And we're not going to solve it today on this podcast, but it's worth talking about,
Right.
because I feel like the only one of the big problems, especially in our world, because we aren't going to fix the big problems, but if we're going to try to address what's happening in the world of alternative music, I think a big starting block to meaningful change is to have a conversation between the influencers. And even though music blogs have taken a back seat to, discovery made possible by streaming and or other big major publications that have way more readers, this alternative community is unlike almost any other in the digital music space, where blogs of all shapes and sizes kind of come together to celebrate these artists, and a lot of them are known people who like, if someone reads modern vinyl, there's a better chance than not that they also read some other alternative music blogs that are considered small by most people, and in
Right.
comparison to spin and stuff. But the problem that a lot of people I don't think understand is that there is like no connection between sites. There is no alternative journalism community or committee or group or club or gang even. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
we are not connected. Before you and I connected over Twitter, like, we didn't know each other. We both did the same thing in the same space, covering the same artist, working with the same publicist, and we had no idea what the other one even looked like or sounded like or thought like.
Right.
And so I feel like that's another contributing factor, is there's no real organization to how news is shared and disseminated, and everyone just kind of is like throwing things at a wall, and we hope that at some point we all stumble upon the next big thing or the next big story. And I think there is a element of lost possibilities through the fact that we don't organize and train better.
Yeah, and I mean, even something as simple as, putting together a Slack group or a Facebook group or something and getting a bunch of these writers together could help, because then a lot of times we could probably pool our resources and kind of get all of the facts from all of the different sides that way. And I mean, personally, when these things happen, like the assault allegations and whatnot, I don't really cover them on my website, because I feel like, one, my site is so small that it really wouldn't make any sort of impact for the amount of time I would have to spend on a story like that. I do think some of the bigger sites, like you mentioned, Chorus, Alternative Press, even Spin, I feel like those are the sites that can really help make a difference in this, because they have such a wider audience than a site like mine does.
You're absolutely right. It does start at the top, but I think it can be influenced from the bottom up. I mean, if we look at alternative press's coverage of allegations in 2015, they didn't really jump on the ball full fledged until the Neck Deep one came up, and I feel like that almost resulted more from the fact that Neck Deep was a recent cover star, and they had a Billboard charting album at the time. But by the time that allegation broke, alternative press was kind of up against a wall where people were like, hey, you guys need to do something, because you are the figurehead of the alternative music news world, and you have to start commenting on this. And they did. And then in October, they ran that, break the silence feature that people have kind of hounded them for ever since, because it seemed like they said one thing and then from a business standpoint did a completely different thing. And the reasons for that are completely up to me, because I feel like a lot of people get on alternative press's case because they try to hold them to the same expectations that you would hold a Chorus or a Modern Vinyl, just because that's who we've been using as an example here. But it's not, because those websites don't rely on tens of thousands of dollars of advertising monthly just to have the doors open.
Right.
There's a lot more relationships and networking and kind of trickery to how a magazine like not trickery, but a lot more messiness to how an operation like Alternative Press has to run. And ever since I've come to Substream, I've had a similar conversation with the owner, Jason. Like, we're moving away from alternative music, kind of trying to target that college demo. People who, because I remember when I hit 18 and I got to college, I kept getting Alternative Press, but I slowly started to feel what they covered and what I was interested in disconnecting. You get a little,
Right.
because they maintain a demographic and you grow out of it eventually. So Substream wants to be the thing that moves up from there. But a big part of that conversation was like, we didn't want to have to cover all these allegations. Not that we don't think that they should be covered, but a problem that they had run into is that you cover the allegations against an artist like Neck Deep, and then the next month you need to sell ad space in your magazine, and the Neck Deep's label's like, oh no, we don't want any part of working with you. It doesn't matter
Right.
that their artist was in the wrong. It matters that you said something against somebody who gave you money. Like that's the trickiness of business journalism and business. At
Yeah,
least in,
definitely.
and it's something that's very specific just to entertainment because like that doesn't have like the Washington Post, like Trump banned them from covering his things, but it's not like the Washington Post ever had a reason to question whether or not it was okay to out Donald Trump. It's okay to out Donald Trump because he's a political figure and his campaign doesn't give anything to the newspaper, nor should it or would it ever do so. But in
Right.
music publications, we rely on music advertisers, and you can't cross the wires there.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's still something that is hard to figure out, obviously. And for a site like mine, I don't run ads or anything. So that's completely different if I chose to cover these things in depth. And honestly, I don't think that just because there are women writers on music sites and everything that every single one of us has to cover these things. Like I said, I didn't even know about the turnover one because I haven't really seen it posted anywhere. And well, I was also in jury duty yesterday, so that kind of hindered my ability to
Yeah.
keep up on things.
Well, there's a few really nice, not nice, but there's a few very creative and driven Twitter accounts that have kind of popped up in the last few months, Defend Girls Not Pop Punk and
Right.
Inclusive Punk and all of them, and they've kind of been all over this story. And I don't know all the details to try to act like it here, but it's basically dude and band is manipulating girls, and there are screenshots to prove it and all that jazz, and it's another case of like shitty dude and band does something shitty. Um, but it's different because, and this is another element of it that I don't think people have really talked about a lot yet, is that there's a certain niche of the alternative music scene that would like to see every allegation of any kind of treated the same way. Like if they view you as a quote unquote shitty person towards women or towards anything, they're like, let's oust you from our community. Like let's blackball them, let's get them out of our scene altogether. But not every allegation, like some like the front porch step one versus the neck deep one versus this turnover one, even though I know you don't know much about it, like they're three very different stories. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
the allegations are different, the evidence is different, and the size of the artist is different, and that does play a role regardless of whether or not people feel it should. So I feel like that's another issue. Like if it's one thing that they're maybe we're covering them the wrong way, but that's another issue that like part of it has to do with the fact that most music writers online don't have proper journalism training, and myself included. I've had to like learn the hard way, but
Right.
people don't know how to treat it, so everything's just allegations, and it's not like, and people write about a rape allegation the same way they write about someone just being a misogynist allegedly, and so there's no scale for like outrage. It's just outrage. It's one voice, one tone, one pitch, and I think that leads to you kind of go deaf to it after a while.
Yeah. And I feel like, with hi fi noise, I don't really focus on the negative aspects of the scene because if I did, I feel like that would literally be all the site was about. So I understand when, it's a site that has a staff and they have a larger amount of people, but my site, it's just me. So it's like if I'm spending all of my time doing one article in depth, it's kind of like the rest of the site is being neglected while I'm doing that. And I'm sure, you just mentioned you don't have a journalism background or, you've been learning the hard way. I like writing, but I would not consider myself a journalist by any means. All I do is I post songs I enjoy and I, write reviews for TV shows, comics, and whatnot that I enjoy. And I'll go talk about sports on those dedicated sites. So I'm not doing the same type of reporting that some of these bigger sites are doing and that they have the resources to do that.
I would agree, though. I always hesitate to call myself a journalist. I feel like a music. I don't know what else to say. Like I'm a music. I also hate the word influencer because it feels like such a such a self-priding word where you're like, oh no, I influence people for a living. Like I don't,
Right.
that's not what I do. And I hate content creator because in some way that feels like you're belittling what you do because you're like, I don't write content. I write like something, you know, it's not just drivel to fill space on the internet. So I do struggle with it. I'm not like a music, I wouldn't say I'm more like a music commentator, I guess.
Yeah, to me, you can be a writer without being a journalist. Like you can be a music writer, someone who just writes about music, or, a film critic because you are in fact critiquing films, but you don't have to be a journalist necessarily. You're not going out and looking for scoops and looking for, the story to end all stories. And I think, that's definitely a distinct difference. Like I would say I'm a music writer, but I wouldn't consider myself a journalist by any means because I don't do all of those things that a journalist does, nor do I really know how to.
That is also accurate. One of the things, you know, I do a lot of talking at schools, and a lot of the things I tell people is there's this old saying about acting that's like, if you love it, just keep doing it, and eventually someone will find a need for you. And I feel like the same thing applies to music, and that's a horrible piece of advice to give somebody, but in my experience, almost 99% of the time that's the case. Like the person who just kind of hangs around the longest eventually gets a job. You know, you make
Right.
yourself known, you talk to somebody enough, eventually someone's going to give you a chance because you've kind of assimilated into being a part of the community. Um, and that's a pro and a con of living in the digital age, where it's like, well, sometimes people get into a position where they have a seat of influence, so to say, and they in no way are like technically prepared for it. You know, they just kind of get it thrust upon them, and then we're like, well, you have to act like a journalistic professional, even though you're still in high school and you have 30,000 followers on Twitter. Like we hold them to this ridiculous standard that's like, well, why would they know what to do with that power?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, a lot of us don't just focus on music. Like I mentioned, you have your film writing that you do, and I already mentioned all of the different things I write about because I am probably crazy. But, I've had some people follow me on Twitter for one reason, and they're like, wow, I didn't realize you like this too, and this, and this, and, whatever. So it's always kind of cool to have people start paying attention to you for one thing and then realize how many different things you do, or how many different interests you have. It's like, just because we mainly focus on music doesn't mean that's the only side to us, basically.
Mm. Exactly. No, and if you're lucky enough, you hang around long enough that you get the opportunity to express those other sides of yourself. I always say that, like, even if you don't end up in music, trying to make it in music is a great primer to succeed in any other area of life. Because in my experience, like everything else is, other than maybe film and other areas of entertainment, everything outside of the world of entertainment is indescribably easier to navigate than the entertainment industry. So if you can figure out how to do it in entertainment, the rest is a piece of cake. Even if you don't end up here, you'll be like, well, when I was in music, I was piss poor for 4 years, but I managed to pay my rent every month off writing. So I think I can be a teacher. Like you'll figure it out.
Right.
So let me ask you, Deanna Chapman, if these things don't come together the way you think they do, like where does Deanna Chapman end up? Like where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Oh, I
Isn't that
have
the
no
worst
idea.
question? I don't know the answer to that for myself, so it's a little unfair of me to ask. I don't know if I could tell you where I see myself in 2 years. Hopefully where I am now, but more successful. But like, that's it's just up in the air at the moment. So for you, like, what does the future hold? What should people
Yeah, I
be looking
mean,
out for?
right. If the music thing doesn't work out, I honestly have no idea because I've put most of my energy into that. Obviously, I majored in music industry, so majoring in music industry doesn't exactly get you into a lot of other areas because it's so specific. I didn't, go major in communications or something like that that could be more broadly applied. So I think even if music necessarily doesn't work out, I think even doing publicity for, brands or video games or what have you, I think that is something I would be perfectly fine doing. But I think right now I definitely want to focus on, trying to make the record label or freelance publicity work because those are the things I really enjoy doing aside from writing. And I know, you know, writing is a lot harder to make happen, especially in a freelance capacity.
Definitely, definitely. I was actually just talking to Ray from Raby this morning about a fellow writer, guy that contributes to the Holics blog a lot, Seth Werkheiser, and he's one of those freelance writers now. He actually started Noise Creep back in the day, and then AOL bought it, and it kind of got buried. And I'm sure Seth's dream when they bought Noise Creep was to run Noise Creep forever. And now here we are about a decade after they bought it. And he's now a freelance writer who runs a metal trivia Twitter account. Like that pays his bills. But the fight
Right.
to get to that point from where he was, that'd be like if I jumped, maybe if UTG died this year and it did, if we jump 10 years in the future and I'm a freelance writer with a metal trivia Twitter, like it's such a big amount of time. But he finally like was able to get to that point where it's like, oh, now all he does is write. But Steph's like in his mid 30s at this point. It's kind of scary to be like, maybe I won't get to like this full time until a lot longer than most people get to their, peak career. Or not even peak career, career.
Right. And, I did have my job last year, but I felt like while it was, allowing me to live in an apartment by myself and pay the bills and everything, it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. And I figured, all right, I'm not really happy with this job. I'll see if my parents will let me move back home and I'll do my stuff while I look for something else that maybe fits more along the lines of what I want to do. And here we are, nearing the end of September and I'm still just doing my stuff. I do get things that pay here and there, but it's, not anything sustainable at the moment. So really, I think I just need to crack down and start, emailing bands, be like, hey, do you guys need publicity? And, my rates are going to be a lot less than a PR firm because I'm not having the overhead of an office or an apartment or anything right now. And I feel like if I can do that and kind of get a core group of clients that will hopefully stay with me, even if I have to, do price increases and whatnot here and there for each album or what have you, to kind of, be able to make a living off of that. I think that's something I'm willing to put a lot of effort in, but that's not something that will necessarily keep me from doing, the website, the writing, and the record label, because with the record label, I have to do PR anyway for those bands. So it really will just kind of depend on whether or not a band wants just PR or if they want help with, getting social media accounts set up, getting this and that set up, getting digital distribution going, because even though you have things like CD Baby and TuneCore, a lot of people think those are the only two options, and they aren't. So it's kind of like, do they just strictly want PR or do they kind of want to learn a lot more about how the music industry works and do that through the label?
You make a good point, and you're right. Most people do only think TuneCore and CD Baby exists. Um, it's one of those weird things where I feel like we're at the cusp of one kind of generation of music sites and companies, and I think we're about to see the dawn of a bunch of new ones. And the new ones are starting all the time. But I've been thinking about this. Yesterday, they announced that Spin Media had sold Pure Volume and Idolater, and I was like, holy crap! When's the last time like people talked about Pure Volume? I mean, it's still a site, and they still get tons of traffic. But remember when Pure Volume was like the source for new music?
Yeah, I kind of chuckle when I get, so and so premiered their song at Pure Volume. I'm like, wait, what? Like, that's still a thing almost. And while I was never a huge Pure Volume user myself, it did end up being a really, really big music site. And I feel like it fizzled out fairly quickly because it's like, it was this big thing and then all of a sudden it kind of wasn't.
Well, it was weird because I felt like Pure Volume was started with these really honest intentions of just being a very simple and straightforward music streaming and discovery platform. And what it is today, it has this big news component to it, and the uploading and sharing of music is kind of a backseat. And what I felt like they always missed was like a combination of the two, because Pure Volume definitely had the traffic to be a huge music site, but it was really
Right.
hard. But they never had anything to kind of keep you there, and they didn't run a lot of original editorial content. Like people would just upload songs there, and it'd be like, you can stream our new song on this website, and it would have a lot of songs from their old records, and you could just kind of spin out, so you could enjoy it all in one place. But there was never an editorial component where they didn't used to do song premieres like on the front page. If they did, it would be like, Hit the Lights premieres a new song. You click on it, and it would just take you to Hit the Lights Pure Volume page,
Right.
and then it would it'd be like there was no original content component to like the development end of it. It was all artist generated content. That's good, but you can't build a community with like 10,000 different tiny groups. You have to find a way to tie them together, and now they've tied them together, but they've lost the little niche market there. I think in part because of Bandcamp. I think Bandcamp kind of swallowed Pure Volume's audience.
Yeah. And I mean, personally, I really love what Bandcamp is doing. And I think the way they have it laid out and everything, I feel like that's really going to be the way to go for a while with, indie musicians, small to mid-sized labels that want to just easily get their music out digitally and not necessarily have to direct everyone to iTunes and Amazon and some of these places that may take bigger cuts.
It's true. It's true. It's weird, but Pure Volume. What I was trying to get to originally is that Pure Volume was kind of one of those flagship things of the music. It was like MySpace and Pure Volume, and Sonic Bids, TuneCore, CD Baby. That's all part of this first generation of music websites, and you can argue that MySpace, like they all died at different times. But I feel like in a cyclical nature of business, we're about to see like a new crop of those websites, and I think maybe Bandcamp is a second generation music blog, a music company,
Right.
but there are not a lot of those yet. And I feel like we're gonna start seeing more of them come around because, like you said, there's a lot of room for innovation in those markets and even in music writing. And I feel like right now, I've been saying this all year long, in music blogging, I feel like we're at like a 10-year low right now. Like the boom of mid 2000s music blogging that gave us bands like Arcade Fire and Brand New propelled to the height of celebrity that they reached and all that stuff. Like that era of music blogs has either died, been sold, or birthed a whole bunch of smaller blogs that never really hit the same heights. There's not been like a new Stereo Gum or Pitchfork in a long time.
Right.
But I feel like we're going to start to see those come up. Someone somewhere maybe they already have it. There's a music blog or two out there right now that I feel are going to stumble into a way to boom again. But it's just right now we're at this lull point right before the second generation kind of crops up in a big way.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm definitely interested in seeing how this sort of all plays out, especially with streaming becoming as popular as it is. And, Apple obviously has the money to keep Apple Music going, even if they get hit with a loss every year for paying the artists. And I feel like the way Apple is set up as a company, that's a hit they can easily take because streaming isn't their sole focus. It's not even their main focus because they're a product company before anything else. And I feel like something is going to happen with either Spotify or Tidal or what have you soon that will kind of make it a even smaller playing field than it already is.
Oh, absolutely. I actually read this morning, the RIAA put out a new report, their first positive growth report in a decade for the music business, which is incredible, which is kind of what got my brain on this like cyclical nature of the business idea. Um, but one of the things they pointed out was that Apple Music, for all of its, I think, 17 million subscribers, they only account for 2% of all the music streamed online right now.
Right.
Like that's insane. It's such a there's so much division right now. YouTube is the big one. YouTube, Spotify, Pandora, and I think it all kind of shrinks from there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. We're going to see some cool things happen in the next year or two. And it's really about not even about writing as much as it is how people meld the success of streaming with music journalism, because I don't think, I mean, Apple Music does it a little bit. Like there are editorial notes to their exclusive releases and stuff like that,
Right.
but there isn't like a, I wish I could go on Spotify and see all the new music headlines along with streaming the songs related to those headlines. Like that would
Yeah.
be a cool component. And if they could spawn, if they partnered with, maybe they partner with a different genre blog, like a hip hop and more does the hip hop, or XXL or Source, and the Boot does all the country music, and Chorus could be the alternative one off the top of my head. It'd probably be Alternative Press, let's be honest. But
Right.
if there's a way to integrate those two things into one, streamline it, it's readership, and I think maybe that's where it's headed. I don't know, but I do feel like when I talk to people like you who are so driven and you're like, I'm going to figure out how to do this, I always am like, you're going to stumble upon something that's like, oh, they haven't done this yet. And that's going to be your ticket.
Right. Yeah, and it's definitely going to be very interesting to see how things play out. Like you said, even within the next year or two, I feel like the music industry has changed so much so quickly that it's like, okay, where are we going from here and how is this going to affect the music industry? Because right now I feel like there aren't a lot of entry level jobs right now. And I feel like that's the main reason I've been having a hard time finding something that I would like to do because more often than not, when I look up jobs, it's like, we need a director for this, a manager for that. You need to have at least 5 years experience. And I'm like, technically, I have been involved in the music industry for at least 5 years, but not in the sort of capacity that these people are looking for. So it'll be really interesting to see how things change and if that ultimately ends up creating more jobs in the music industry or if it makes it an even smaller amount than it already is.
Definitely. I feel like at some point in the last 10 years, we confused the word intern with entry level. And they're like, well,
Right.
they'll work for free until we can pay them. But like, if you start getting paid, it's like you immediately jump to like at least it's not a ton of compensation. Most people are making like 30 grand or less, but it's always a big jump. Like there are definitely like no part time music industry jobs.
Right.
You're either working way too much for free or you're working way too much and getting paid pennies.
Yeah, and at a certain point, with internships being the sort of entry level jobs, it's like, okay, I've done at least 3 to 4 internships. And now that I'm done with college, I don't want to do another internship because when you're done with college, you can't live off of an internship. Like, there's just no way. And yes, I know I'm living at home right now, but I feel like I've already kind of almost been there, done that with the whole internship thing, considering I started interning in the music industry in high school. And then I had to do 2 internships for Drexel, and I ended up doing 3 instead of just the required 2, albeit 2 were both at Fearless Records, but I interned in different areas of the music industry when I went back to Fearless the second time. And it's I don't want to say it's necessarily insulting that they think people just want to work for free. I think what's worse is the fact that they know they can convince people to work for free.
No, it is. It is. It's one of the. I had my first internship was at a radio promotions publicity place in Boston. That when I like my first week of being there, they found out they were going out of business.
Wow.
But so like I immediately knew like this is not going to become a job. And then for the rest of the summer, I was like, well, why would I put forth 100% effort? Like none of these people have a job, let alone are they able to give me a job. But I think a lot of times, even in successful workplaces like Fearless, I'm sure you had this thought at some point where you're like, okay, they seem to have as many people on staff right now as they can, and they're like basically a family because all these little music companies are basically families. And you're like, okay, well, either they're going to have to fire one of these integral parts of their company, or they're going to have to somehow find an extra $35,000 in their budget that they don't need to put into music to hire me. But like, how am I going? Like, it's one of those things where you kind of you realize pretty early on, like, oh, there's probably not a job here for me.
Right.
And that's kind of it's insulting because like they don't necessarily put that on Front Street. You know, like if you want to intern for any record label, they'll gladly welcome you in, but it only takes about 3 days of being there to be like, oh, you don't, this isn't going to go anywhere. Most likely, you're not hiring me.
Yeah, and I mean, we even saw it with some of the bigger companies like Warner and Sony and all of these companies that were getting sued by interns because they were doing the, oh, go get me my coffee thing and go make copies of this and make copies of that. And it's like, okay, what good is that? Everyone knows how to get coffee and make copies. It's not, it's not a learning experience at that point. And that's really how a lot of companies get away with not paying because they're like, oh, you're going to be working hands on and it'll be a learning experience. So then we don't have to pay you. And then, when you get out of college, like I did at the end of 2014, the internships start to say, oh, for college credit only, for this only. And you're like, okay, so where are the entry level jobs that will actually pay me because I'm not in college anymore?
Yeah, and I've learned through a few different people that some companies, people that are in charge of interns, actually intentionally make their interns do the coffee thing and stuff like that because they work in an environment where they're like, I don't even know if this place is going to be open next year, so like I need to fight for my job. So if I give you pointless tasks to do as an intern, you don't have an opportunity to look like you could be better at this job than I am. You know what I mean? It's almost like
Right.
they're self-destructing. Well, they're destroying potential competition while also having to technically be supporting an intern. You know what I mean? Because it's impossible not to view you as a threat to their job on some level.
Yeah, and I mean, being at Fearless, I didn't get that at all. The first summer I interned as the street marketing intern. So I was sending a lot of stuff to the street team. And while that's not necessarily something that's educational, because I'm just mailing a bunch of stuff out most of the time, it's still something that someone needs to do. So it's not like I was going over to Starbucks and getting people their coffee and coming back and then just sitting there twiddling my thumbs the rest of the day. They actually had me doing something that needed to be done. And it was the same when I was doing publishing there. I was sending out emails upon emails every day to try and get songs placed in, TV shows and what have you. And that's something that is productive and you can learn from more so on the publishing side of that. But it was still something, like I said, that needed to be done. So I didn't feel like I was being cheated out of, an internship or anything because I wasn't being useful.
Right, right. Well, let's find a way to wrap this up. Well, I feel like we had a really great conversation, but it's been a pretty negative conversation overall.
That's
So
true.
let's leave people
Sorry.
with some hope. Let's leave people with some hope. How do we find hope in all of this? Well, let's say something positive. But you believe. I feel like you believe in the music business. Like you believe we'll get there.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, a lot of these negative things have not personally happened to me. So I am aware they have happened and they happen to a lot of people. But for me, I just feel like, okay, I've had clearly a much better relationship with the music industry than a lot of people have had. So how do I kind of keep that going? And, how do we try and make it better for everyone else who has had these negative experiences? And I think there are a lot of people in the music industry who are genuinely good people. And, I feel like it's those few bad apples that kind of ruin it for everyone at, a specific point in time. Like, I think we just need to find a way to focus on the things that are going well in the music industry. Like we mentioned, these changes that are coming with streaming becoming more prominent and everything, we can all look at those as a positive thing because streaming is way better than illegally downloading music. Artists are still getting compensated, even though it's not as much as, sales would compensate them. But we're still moving in this positive direction where we're trying to get fewer and fewer people illegally downloading music and getting more and more people rewarding these artists for their work that they're doing. And I think if we keep rewarding these artists, those artists will be more willing to pay people to do their jobs.
I completely agree. I'm with you. I'm always say that as much as I feel like the only way to be, I guess, a true music professional is to kind of embrace the negative sides. Or at least you have to recognize them. Some people want to pretend like
Right.
everything's fine or everything's getting better. There's a lot of problems, but at the end of the day, like I don't think the music industry has bigger fans than you and I and other people who see it that way. Because you gotta root for it. Like you root for your favorite artist to be the next big thing. You gotta root for the music industry to figure its shit out, for lack of a better word. You gotta hope that at one
Yeah.
point we're gonna figure it out. Because time and time again throughout the history of music, in different genres and different artists, there are countless stories about people who have figured it out. That's kind of what all great success stories in the music industry begin with somebody figuring it out. Figuring out how to reach somebody, figuring out how to market somebody, figuring out how to pay people. um, it's a constant learning curve, and right now the music industry has this really big kind of evolution that it needs to do. The industry has been around, like if you think about Sun Records launching in early 1950s, this is like the first kind of modern record label. The internet as we know it today only comes along like 30 years later,
Right.
and it grows and evolves way faster than the music industry. The music industry is still, by and large, a very young industry, and it has a lot of growing up left to do. But I think we'll get there, and people like you, who I immensely respect and I look up to in terms of your drive and your work ethic and just everything you do, I feel like you're gonna find your place because you're recognizing the problems that the industry has, and that you don't let it deter you.
Right. And, that's not to say I don't get down some days more than others, like, okay, I don't have a job. I really need a job, like, why can't I find a job sort of thing. But it's like, I went into this knowing what to expect. And I feel like a lot of people go into it not knowing what to expect. And I think that's really where, you know, the music industry needs to be a little more transparent with how things are. And, a business is a business. Just because the music industry works differently in some aspects, business still needs to happen and business still needs to be done and people still need to be paid. That's going to be the same no matter what industry you're in. And people talk a lot, about the tech industry too and how brutal that is. So it's like we just need to, I think, find a way to make it more transparent, probably a little less brutal in a lot of different senses here. And I think once we figure out how to do that, the music industry might not seem quite as intimidating.
I agree. I agree. Well, Deanna Chapman, you have officially become one of the longest episodes of Inside Music, which I think I was just one of the longer episodes of your show, so that's only
Yes,
fair.
I think you came in second.
All together, if they listen to both episodes back to back, it's like sitting through Batman v Superman, except it's more entertaining and we don't fight.
Yes, yes, this is very true. I promise next time you have me on, this will be a much more positive conversation. We can talk about all the great music next time.
Let's definitely get you back on. Do you have like last question, because this is something I've been kicking around a lot for myself. You talked about episode 50 coming up. Like, is episode 50 for Misaligned gonna be like an event of some kind? I don't think episode 50 of this show is an event. I wanted it to be, but then I was like, I'll just get an episode out. So for you, is it going to be a special episode of some kind?
Well, we had to change the scheduling a little bit because episode 49 was our book club episode, and typically I would do a guest episode next, but I didn't really want to do a guest episode for the 50th episode because I feel like, depending on the guest, they probably wouldn't even care really that it was the 50th episode, especially if it was, just someone who, their publicist hit me up and they wanted them on the show, and they probably haven't listened to the show. So we're going to do a regular episode, but I have not figured out what to do yet because I don't want to make the episode all about me just because I'm the only one who's been on all 50 episodes. I kind of want to make it more about the idea of Misaligned and kind of where we're going to go from here and how we manage to do another 50 episodes.
I like it. Kind of like a look back and a look to the future all in one.
Yeah, I think it'll definitely be like a misaligned, introspective kind of episode.
Well, episode 100 of this show will be a guest episode. It'd be weird. I've thought there's a half episode at one point where we had to take a couple of breaks off for some personal stuff, and so I did like a mini episode that was just me talking to the audience. But I realized like I only need to do one of those, maybe one every 100 episodes. So my episode 100 will have a guest. It'll have
Yeah, and we only have one half episode as well, so I'm not really counting that
yeah.
because it was kind of like an addition to
Yeah.
sort of thing.
I guess yeah. I have a couple. I have a couple of halvesies. Sometimes it's just like Butch Vig is considered a half episode because we had like a good conversation, but he specifically came on to promote a very specific thing, so the whole conversation's kind of built around that one thing. So I didn't think it was
Right.
like a classic one to say music. But since you're on the show and we're on this show, I'll tell people now like. So I've been trying to plan a guest 100. So I've been like reeling my mind. Who do I know that hasn't been on the show, that has a story to tell, that hasn't already done a ton of other podcasts? Because we have someone coming. You're on the show this week because Aaron Gillespie dropped out, and I know he's going to do the show next week. But like there was a last minute delay, and so like there's already some nice guests on the horizon. But they're also I know that they're doing the podcast rounds. Like Anthony Green is. I know that he's going to be on a podcast that's coming out I think tomorrow. I forget which one. But he's going to do this show soon. So like they're in podcast mode right now. I don't want one
Yeah,
of those.
yeah.
I don't want one of those guests.
Right. I can definitely tell when that happens because, I'll get your episode, I'll get, noise creators and, even sometimes Modern Vinyl will have the same guest.
Oh,
I'm
it's
just
so
like,
frustrating because
all right.
they don't tell us, and I guess I should start to learn to ask because I don't have any expectations of exclusivity, but there's only so many hour-long conversations one person can have in like a week span that are going to be on the same topic but different. But so
Yeah.
right now we have a yes, and another thing about episode 100, we're doing it in person. So like I'm gonna fly to wherever the guest of episode 100 is, and I'm gonna do the episode in person so that it's like
Awesome.
Like I said, we're gonna do a quality reset. So now we're gonna change it up a little bit. But right now, that guest is Craig Owens of Chiodos.
Nice. Nice.
And he's never done a podcast, so it'll be and a lot of people don't know what the hell he's doing right now, and myself included. Like Chiodos hasn't updated their social since November of last year, but they haven't broke up. But I know that Bradley, the second writer of Chiodos, is selling insurance in Flint, Michigan right now. So there's a lot of things. And Craig released all those weird solo EPs and tracks for a while there, and now he's in the studio. He wrote a bunch of bands' albums. He's a staff writer at In Vogue Records, writing for a bunch of bands, and he has a lot of stuff going on. So right now the plan is that I'll fly to Detroit for episode 100, and we're going to do a long conversation with Craig Owens, but that might change because he is not an easy man to get a hold of. Like we text, but I told someone the other day that texting with Craig Owens, and he knows I say this, so I don't mind saying it on something that's public record, but texting with Craig Owens is like texting your best friend, right? And then they see your text, travel to the moon, travel back, recover, and then they send you a follow-up reply. Like it's a process where if I text him on Monday, if I've heard back by Wednesday, we're good. And you just can't take offense to it. It's just what happens.
Yeah.
You know how it is in the music business. Some people are just busy. You just gotta hope that they have time when you need them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I've done this to you where, I think I sent you something, like a Fantastic Four thing or something. And I was like, hey, did you check this? Did you check this? I was like, okay, I think I'm going to stop emailing him because it might be bothering him.
And it's not like, and I've read it and I think it's great, but finding the time to be like, this is great. Here's what we should do with it. Hey, let's do that.
Right.
Because you have the same thing where it's like, it's not just saying yes to something. It's like as soon as I say yes, then we have to do all of the other things that go with what yes implies. You know what I mean? Like if I say yes, I want to run the thing that you sent me, and then I want to bring you onto Substream, and we got to get you trained at Substream, and we got to do this, and it's like, okay, I got to find room to do all of those things. So
yeah, and I think when I hit you up about it, it was like right when you were getting ready to get married. I was like, oh, oops.
Yeah, yeah. That happens a lot. I got an email on the day of my wedding, press release that was like, I know it's your wedding day, but I wanted to make sure you saw this band's new video. So I appreciate it. Not everyone has that tact. But okay. We made it an hour and 15 minutes. It'll be 120 with my introduction. I never do this. Do you want to choose the song that's your intro song? Do you have something you're listening to right now that I can drop a few seconds in because you're not a musical guest?
Ooh, let's see. I would definitely toss in one of the new Fossil Youth singles
Okay,
from
I've been listening to that album too.
Yes, yes. And I always have permission from Joe to use his songs, so I'm sure it will not be a problem. I really wanted to give you something like Jimmy Eat World, but I don't want anyone getting in trouble for using Jimmy Eat World this far in advance.
No, I think I'll get away with the Fossil Youth just well, and they're going to be on the show soon. So anyone that likes the song they heard at the beginning of this episode, we're going to do one of these. I do like sometimes I do two guests in one episode, like Steal from Mark Maron. I do like 10 minutes with somebody at the top of another conversation.
Right.
So I'm gonna do one of those with Fossil Youth in the near future. So if you like the song that opened this episode, go pre-order it because that album's up for pre-order now. And then hang around, and maybe they'll be on 100. Maybe they'll be a guest on 100. Who knows?
Nice, nice. Going to have to listen to that.
Yeah, now you have to. Now you're in. All right, so one play guaranteed of episode 100. All right, Deanna, I'm going to let you get to your day, but thank you so much for letting me eat up your morning.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
All right, everyone, check it out. Where can they find you on Twitter and everything, real quick?
On Twitter, I am at DChap, but that is with 3 E's. So it is DEEECHAP because literally no version of my actual name is available on Twitter. At Deanna is taken, at Chapman is taken, at Deanna Chapman is taken, at Deanna_Chapman is taken. So I've given up. Even with, I think, my middle initial, it's taken. So at some point, it's just going to be way too long of a name to even want it as your Twitter handle. And that is what I ended up with. So that is what it is. And from there, you can probably find all of the various places that I write for. I think I somehow managed to squeeze them all into the little Twitter bio there.
Alrighty, well then everyone go check that out and listen to Misaligned if you need an episode to start with. I was just on one, so find that one.
Yes, work your way backwards.
And if you want to find that online, it's at the Modern Vinyl website, right? modern-vinyl.com.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's everything. And this will be out probably later today. I actually am leaving work early to go to a movie screening because I'm sneaky like that.
Nice.
But this will be out soon.
Awesome.
All right. You have a great day, Deanna.
You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.